President Trump will sit down with Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky and multiple European leaders at the White House. This comes after President Trump's 3-hour meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday. In that meeting, Trump demanded a ceasefire before the meeting even happened, but dropped that demand for a broader peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. In the past couple of minutes, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted on social media about his meeting with the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. Zelensky wrote, quote, "Russia can only be forced into peace through strength." Meanwhile, Russia is showing no signs of slowing down on the battlefield. Overnight, a Russian drone attack killed at least 10 people across Ukraine and injured dozens more. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Holly Williams has more from Ukraine.
For over 3 years now, Ukrainians have been fighting to defend every square foot of their country. They have been applauded for their courage, but make no mistake, they are exhausted by this war. Nearly 70% of Ukrainians now support a negotiated peace deal, according to a recent poll, and that's up from just over 20% at the beginning of the invasion. Yet the devil is in the details. President Vladimir Zelensky has said it would be unconstitutional to permanently cede to Russia the parts of his country that are currently under occupation. That is around a fifth of Ukraine's territory. And many Ukrainians who we've spoken to say that giving up swaths of their country and the people who live there is not a price they're willing to pay, even if it brings peace. Meanwhile, Ukraine and its allies in Europe also fear that sacrificing Ukrainian territory to Russia would set a dangerous precedent, effectively rewarding Vladimir Putin for his invasion and even encouraging him to do it again. Back to you.
All right, for more on this, let's bring in CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata. Charlie, break down the potential security guarantees being discussed for Ukraine and whether they are enough.
You know, Vlad, I just heard our colleague Holly say the devil is in the details, and that is exactly the case when it comes to these security guarantees, because we generally don't know what they are yet. But the very fact that they're being discussed is a reason for optimism, and as we understand it from Steve Witkoff, who is part of the negotiations for what we want to call it, that what happened in Alaska, that has been proposed. In fact, Russia itself wants some sort of security guarantees. So basically what they're talking about is, you know how Putin has been fighting against Ukraine ever joining NATO. That is a deal breaker from any part of the negotiations. But what we might be looking at is like a Chapter 5 NATO agreement, as in European partners, NATO partners, would be in charge of some security guarantees for Ukraine, and that might mean the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean that U.S. troops, boots will be on the ground. We have seen that the United States is capable of defending other nations, including Israel, without having to have a large U.S. troop presence there. They've got the resources to do so. But really, that is going to be down to details. And as far as is it going to help, look, you know, I was in Ukraine in 2014 when they were fighting over the Donbass region. Russian forces had taken over parts of that territory. They still have that territory. And then a Minsk agreement was put in place. Pretty much ever since, both sides have been breaking that ceasefire. I'm talking about before the invasion of 2022. So there have been violations throughout, from Russia and from Ukraine fighting each other in that region.
Okay, we just put up the president's social media post where he indicates that Ukraine would not get back Crimea and that they would not be admitted into NATO. That would be one of those concessions.
Exactly.
Is that something that Zelensky could go back with? Because it sounds like what seemed to be murmured and speculated about in the hours after that meeting with Putin and Trump was that whatever territorial gains Putin made in this particular war, Ukraine would have to concede. Am I reading that? How are you reading that, Charlie?
Vlad, you are reading that right, because I don't see another way to read that. And of course, the Ukrainians, Crimea to one side, I think that has been a dream. Crimea is lost to the Russians, and that's going to be a hard thing to get back. There are a lot of people in Crimea that are happy to be part of Russia. I'm not saying that that was justified in taking over. That was an illegal occupation of Ukrainian territory. However, what President Putin is sort of putting forward is that 4 different oblasts would go under Russian command. those places aren't fully occupied by Russia. It would take years, according to the pace of the conflict so far, for those Russian forces to advance to even occupy those areas. So it's not just that Putin wants the areas that Russia has taken over, that territory, but wants all of those regions that they still haven't, quote, captured. They claimed possession of those regions while I was there, September 22, 23, something like that, in the Donbass region, going all the way up to Zaporizhia and Dnipro, but the Russians don't control or own that territory. So Putin is actually stretching his hand a little bit more than even where the Russians have control or at least occupation of those areas.
So, okay, so then, all right, so if that's the case, then I guess two things. One, what's to prevent, first of all, could Zelensky even return to Ukraine if he agreed to allowing Russia to control or try to at least to take control of the regions that they've won during this war? I mean, his whole purpose, his whole reason of being has been to either prevent the Russians from taking over Ukrainian territory or Ukraine and to push the Russians out. If the United States is not willing, then it sort of the question that I have is, what does Zelensky do? And the second question is, have you ever seen anything like this where the United States says there are no penalties for conducting an illegal war? And thus, if there are no penalties, Charlie, you've covered these international conflicts your entire career. What's to prevent Putin from saying in 2 or 3 years, you know what, I want the rest of Ukraine? What's the worry? The United States isn't going to do anything about it.
You know, Zelensky has said, even in the past 24 hours, in English, by the way, that he doesn't want to give up an inch of Ukrainian territory to the Russians for this illegal invasion, because that is very black and white. Russians invaded Ukraine. And Zelensky has made clear that he wants all of that territory back. And this needs to be some sort of punishment. You've seen the Ukrainians were enraged to see that the red carpet was rolled out for somebody who, you know, illegally invaded their country. So there's a lot of anger there. But as Holly said, about 70% of that country want the war to come to an end. They've lost hundreds of thousands of people, you know, forces and civilians in this conflict. And then again, if you give President Putin an inch, he will take a mile. That's been proven time and time again. And I think that's why we saw how disastrously Zelensky's visit to the White House was last time. These NATO members here, these very high-ranking members, I mean, these are heads of state that are coming here. This is all about supporting Zelensky because they realize that what they're seeing in this Russian aggression in Ukraine could be happening to them next.
Yeah, I mean, that was my next question, which is, okay, so you hold Putin back, you let him keep what he's gained. That's something that hasn't been done since the Sudetenland. And then if you're another dictator somewhere else in the world, you say, well, you know, I'm going to shoot my shot because the United States isn't willing to stop me from doing so. Really interesting to see what will happen later this afternoon, Charlie. Thank you very much for your insight, analysis, and reporting, my friend, always.
Thanks, Vlad. Thank you.